Here's 7 ways to self-host N8N. Each one gets more advanced and unlocks something new, but we're starting with a way to self-host N8N in 60 seconds. Let's go. So first we're going to have a look at Hostinger, who make it really easy to self-host N8N. So if you go through this page, it's going to pre-configure your server. So I'm going to click choose plan, and we're just going to go for a KVM1, a kernel-based virtual machine. This has got 4 gig RAM, which is plenty to get started with. So I'm going to go through the cart. I'm just going to pay for this for 1 month. And if you scroll down here, you can set your server location, and you can see that N8N is pre-selected as our OS. So I'm going to click continue, go through the payment, set all that up. And then once we've hit that, we've got to wait for our VPS to get up and running. Once that's done, we'll get redirected to a page like this. And if you click Manage App, it should take you straight into your new self-hosted N8N instance. Now, if when you signed up for Hostinger, you didn't go through that N8N page, you'll need to configure your own OS. You'll get to a page like this, and you'll just need to type in N8N. You'll see that 3 options come up. The one you want is the first one with the star. But it's much easier if you go through that N8N page, which I'll drop in the description below. So in 60 seconds, we've just cut down our N8N running costs by about 67%. Now, this is the simplest way to self-host N8N, and it's what I'd recommend for anyone who isn't comfortable with DevOps or managing their own server infrastructure. It's also what I personally use. For me, it's a pragmatic option because it provides virtually all of the benefits of self-hosting N8N with the fewest headaches. Updating N8N is easy, persistent storage is taken care of, and I get 10 to 100 times the CPU and RAM that I get on N8N Cloud for 1/3 of the cost. But if you want a bit more control over the tech stack, then our next options, Railway and Render, are probably going to be a better fit. At the end, by the way, I'll compare the pricing and the specs of all 7 self-hosting options side by side. Plus, we'll touch on 3 self-hosting mistakes you'll want to avoid. But first, let's have a look at Railway. So there's 3 things that are notable about Railway. Firstly, it's got an amazing developer experience. You'll see in a moment, it's got this beautiful canvas that you can build your infrastructure on. I absolutely love it. I think it's really nice and intuitive to use. Secondly, it's incredibly easy to get up and running. You don't need to configure your servers. It's just as easy as hosting, and we can literally click a few buttons and we've got N8N up and running. Where Railway gets a bit interesting is when it comes to pricing. So with Railway, you only pay for what you use, and you're charged by the second for your memory and CPU usage. Now, this can be great, particularly if your execution load is lumpy or seasonal, but the downside is it makes it really difficult to know what you're actually going to pay. I worked out that an empty instance of N8N costs about $4 a month to run, whereas the N8N instance I use for my YouTube channel that has about 20 workflows in it would have cost about $30 a month to run. But it's very difficult to know for sure because memory and CPU usage fluctuates. So with that said, let's get N8N up and running. So we're going to click Deploy New Project, and Railway give you $5 free credit when you sign up, so you don't have to pay anything or pop a card in. So you could deploy N8N from a repo or a Docker image, but the easiest way to get up and running is from a template. This kind of configures everything behind the scenes in a very sensible way. So we're going to click template and select N8N, and you can see this is going to deploy 4 services. So we can see they're all ready to be deployed. We can go in and configure them if you want, but we're going to hit deploy. And this is going to take us to that really nice canvas that I mentioned. So we can see it's creating this down here on activity. We just need to wait for a few minutes for all of these to deploy. It took about 6 minutes in the end. I had to redeploy the primary service because the worker wasn't online when it was trying to deploy. But that's all up and running. If we click into this, we should be able to get our URL, and N8N should be up and running on this. Yep, so should be able to sign up, and that should be all working nicely. Get our license key. So let's just go back to Railway, and I'll just show you a couple of things. So if you click into any of these services, you can get a few bits of data. You can configure backups if it's a database. You could set up a custom domain for your N8N instance. If you want to play around with the hardware specs of that resource, you can do that all here. Settings, one thing worth noting, so you can configure your webhooks here. Also under integrations, we can connect this to Versal. So if you want to host N8N on Versal, Versal isn't compatible with Docker images by default, so this is an indirect way that you could get your N8N instance on Versal if you wanted to do that. And then, as I mentioned, when it comes to backups, which I would say is extremely important if you're self-hosting N8N, we can go into the Postgres database, click backups, but you will need to have a pro plan to activate this. Now, I mentioned earlier, the main disadvantage with Railway is that you have this kind of pricing structure that makes it very difficult to know how much you're actually going to pay. If you want to have something very similar to Railway, but you don't want to have that price uncertainty, you might want to consider the next tool that we're going to look at, which is Render. So next, we're going to self-host N8N on render.com. Now, this shares a lot of similarities with Railway in the sense that it's very easy to use. They take care of all the infrastructure for us. But the main difference is we don't have that price uncertainty. With Render, we pay a fixed monthly fee, and we'll talk about what that fee is in a moment. But let's first talk through how to get N8N up and running. So we're going to deploy our app for free, and we're going to use a blueprint. So to do that, we're going to go to this GitHub repo. I'll drop a link to this, and we're going to create a new repo from this one. I'm just going to name it N8N render. We'll create that repo and go back into render, click new blueprint instance and connect that repo. So we'll give our blueprint a name, render test. And basically what this is going to do is it's going to create a Postgres database and connect it to a web service that is using the official N8N Docker image. Okay, that's finished deploying. So if we now go over to the resources, click on our N8N service, we should be able to get this URL where it's deployed the web service to. So we click on that, we should now have N8N up and running. There we go. We can create an account, go through the usual, sign up, and we're in. Okay, so N8N is up and running. That all looks good to me. So let's touch on pricing. So Render have a free plan where you can get all this up and running for testing purposes free of charge. The downside is that after 15 minutes of inactivity, it's going to spin down your resources. So fine for testing, not fine for production. So you can see here that we've got two services. We've got the main N8N service, and then we've got the database, and we're going to have to pay for both of these. So if we go into the service initially, and I'm just going to go to upgrade, you can see the pricing. I recommend looking at this here rather than their pricing page because some of these are not reflected on their pricing page. So for N8N, really, we want to have a minimum of 2 gig RAM. So we're looking at the standard plan to start with, which is going to be $25 a month for that main N8N service. If we go over to our Postgres, because we're going to have to pay for that separately, do the same thing. If we go to basic, we're probably going to want the 1 gigabyte database. So that one is $19 a month. So all up to run N8N on Render, we're looking at about $44 a month, which is relatively expensive to my mind. Now, next we're going to have a look at Sliplane, which is about a quarter of the cost. So Sliplane is an incredibly affordable way of hosting your Docker containers. I'm going to show you later in the video how to get N8N running locally using Docker. I'll also pop instructions in the description below, but we actually don't need to worry about that yet. We can use someone else's image. Before we do the setup there, I want to just touch on pricing because what Sliplane is able to offer for the amount they charge is pretty incredible. So on their base plan, which is €9 or about $11 a month, we get 2 virtual CPUs, 2 gig of RAM and 40 gig of storage, which is just about enough to run N8N safely. Ideally, we'd upgrade to medium to get the 4 gig of RAM, but we can always upgrade that later. So let's jump in and get N8N up and running. So we're going to create a project, it's called N8N, and go into that project and deploy a service. So we've selected the project, we're going to select this server and now add a service. Now here's where you could deploy N8N from Docker Hub or GitHub Container Registry or a repo, but the easier way to do this is just to use the pre-configured N8N image. So we'll click that, we can add that service, hit deploy. So that's finished deploying. If we click the domain, we should now have N8N up and running, which looks good to me. Now over here, if we click on the server, we can see our usage. We can upgrade the server if need be and standard settings. If we want to set up a custom domain, we can go over to here, add a custom domain. And a really impressive thing about Sliplane is they don't charge extra for all of this. This is all included in the €9 a month, which is pretty incredible, especially when considering, I believe that they're running on Hetzner infrastructure, which is very high quality. So in terms of bang for buck, what you get for that €9 a month is pretty impressive. Now, the last few hosts we've looked at are relatively small and new companies. And given that N8N is going to connect to your tools and potentially going to manage sensitive information, it's completely understandable that you might want to use a hosting company that's a bit more established and not ran by 2 guys. So the next 2 options we're going to look at are much larger, much more established. We're going to start with Heroku. So the easiest way to deploy N8N to Heroku is from this page. I'll link to this in the description below. But if you scroll down here and click deploy to Heroku, this is going to create an app on Heroku with some of the environment variables and configurations preset. So let's go ahead and call this N8N deployment 3, and we're going to dismiss that. You can see here the pricing it's going to cost to run this. And I'm just going to change this. We'll talk about security in a bit more detail in a moment, but I'm just going to go through and change these settings, encrypt, and we're going to pop in our app name here. So that all looks good to me. So I'm going to hit deploy app, and then we just wait a moment for that to build. Okay, that's run into an issue because apparently Heroku no longer support Postgres version 14. So I'm going to try and fork the repo, change the version and see if that works. Otherwise, I will call it a day on Heroku and we'll go to DigitalOcean. So let's see if we can do this. Let's fork this. Okay, let's go to app.json and I'm just going to quick edit. Wow, this is reckless. Version 15, commit, boom, commit. Let's try again. Bosh. True, London, encrypt. See how far we get. Huh, that actually worked. So that is building the app. If we go into the main Heroku dashboard here, we can see that it's provisioning the database. So hopefully in a second, we will have built the app. So I might have got a bit ahead of myself. Although the build apparently succeeded and it's deployed it, if I click open app, I'm getting an application error, which I imagine might be because it's still somewhere referencing the unsupported version of Postgres, but I'm not entirely sure. If you do know why this is happening, please let me know. I did have a look at the logs and there was nothing immediately that jumped out at me as having failed. So at this point, I'm going to call it a day with Heroku and instead have a look at DigitalOcean. So of the options we've looked at today, DigitalOcean is the one that puts you most in control of the infrastructure. Now, the easiest way to self-host N8N on DigitalOcean is going to be by using a droplet. So this is basically just a virtual machine. So we can select the location where we want to host that. And then when we scroll down here, you can either configure this yourself or you can do it on easy mode, select marketplace, click the N8N image, and then you'll need to select the specs that you want for the virtual machine. So for this example, I'm just going to go for the lowest one, but if I were doing this in production, I would probably choose something like this. And we've got 2 CPUs and ensuring that we've got at least 4 gig and the storage depends on what you're storing, but probably about 80 to 90 gigabytes sounds about right to me. But for this example, we're just going to go on this one just so I don't rack up tons of costs making this video. We need to create a root password and you can add that if you want. But once you've filled out all of that, we're just going to click create droplet, wait for that to deploy. That's all done, but to access this, I'm going to need to connect a domain. So I'm going to click into add a domain, go ahead and connect one. If we then take our IP address and I've popped that in as an A record on Cloudflare, wait a few hours, and then our domain should have propagated and we have N8N up and running on DigitalOcean. So we've covered 6 ways to self-host N8N, but if you want to run N8N actually for free, you'll need to run it locally, which is what we're going to run through next. Before that though, you may have noticed that the self-hosted version of N8N requires you to register a license in order to unlock some of the paid features. But there are still 11 features that you don't get access to when self-hosting N8N. These are single sign-on, custom variables, environments, external secrets, external storage for binary data, log streaming, multi-main mode, projects, sharing of workflows and credentials, version control, and workflow history. Now, some of these have easy workarounds like environments. You could just set up different environments with your host. And most of these are features that you're only going to get on N8N Cloud's enterprise plan anyway. So if you're using N8N for a large enterprise, you'll probably need to stick around with N8N Cloud. With that little PSA out of the way, let's have a look at setting up N8N locally. So first thing you'll need to do if you haven't already is download Docker Desktop. I'll include a link to this in the description. So you just click here, download that. So then drag Docker into your applications folder, wait for that to copy across. Then you need to go through the usual sign up stuff, and then you should have Docker all up and running. So you don't need a paid plan or anything at this point. So next you want to go to this page. Again, I'll drop a link to this below. Copy this command and just drop it into a text editor. And before you pop this into your terminal, you just need to update your time zone. So the easiest way of doing this is going to momentjs.com. And if you hover over here, you'll see the exact formatting for your time zone. So we just write Europe/London, and we need to do that on the line below. Copy that whole thing and then go to your terminal, and we're just going to paste that straight in there, hit enter. So this is just downloading the official N8N Docker image. We should see in a moment that we have an image locally. Great. So we can see that's now downloaded that image. So now you can copy that URL, drop it into your browser, and you should then have N8N up and running. Now, running N8N locally is great for personal use and testing, but not particularly practical if you're using this for a business, which is where the other 6 self-hosting options are a better choice. But we're not quite done yet, because there are some pretty major landmines you can step on when self-hosting N8N. So next, we're going to cover 3 major self-hosting pitfalls and how to avoid them. I've also created a pre-production checklist that you can download below. First up though, the bane of my life, data loss. Now, it's easy enough at the best of times to lose hours of N8N work due to it not having an autosave. But self-hosting makes this all the more likely because you manage the storage. Now, by default, N8N uses SQLite, which is fine for testing, but it becomes problematic with multiple users or heavy workflow usage. My advice would be to always use Postgres from day one to avoid migration headaches later on. Now, most of the hosts in this video use Postgres by default, but if you choose a host that doesn't, I'd recommend connecting it to something like Supabase that runs Postgres. Also, regardless of how you self-host, make sure that you set up daily backups. Now, the next pitfall is something that's even more critical, which is to avoid exposing your N8N instance to attacks. Now, there's lots of risks here, but the main 5 are not using HTTPS, running your N8N instance directly on public ports, using weak authentication, running an outdated version of N8N, and storing your credentials insecurely. Now, this last one is a pretty big deal because it puts not just your N8N data at risk, but potentially the data from the services you're connecting to N8N. Now, it's beyond the scope of this video and frankly my competence to talk about server security, but in short, if you know how to set up a server securely, make sure you do, and if you don't, either find someone who does or just use N8N Cloud. Now, lastly, and arguably the biggest of the 3 pitfalls is racking up crazy costs due to scaling and performance issues. N8N is pretty lightweight, but it still benefits from having access to a decent amount of RAM, CPU, and storage. So N8N lists these as the minimum requirements, but this depends on your workflow. If you're running complex RAG agents or moving large files around, you'll probably need higher specs to avoid timeouts. On the flip side, given how easy it is to accidentally create loops and unintended executions in N8N, you'd be wise to mitigate against this with monitoring, alerting, and budget caps. Now, if you're on a flat fee host like Hostinger or Render, this isn't a huge risk, but it's something I would definitely prioritize if you're using a host that has elastic pricing like Sliplane. So here's all 7 self-hosting options compared side by side on price and hardware. You can get this below along with the pre-production checklist and the decision tree. And a final point worth mentioning is to not underestimate the value of your experience. If you're deeply familiar with a particular host, even one that I've not covered like AWS or Google Cloud, consider that because self-hosting N8N comes with a huge amount of challenges. You're going to get storage corruptions, N8N updates will cause chaos, nodes will randomly stop working. And the real cost of self-hosting N8N is that these become your responsibility to fix. So knowing the ins and outs of a particular host can be the difference between self-hosting N8N actually saving you money versus it costing you in extra DevOps costs and headaches. And it's for that reason that I use Hostinger, because I've used it since 2014 and they take care of most of the faff, while I get to run N8N for a fraction of the cost. Now, if you've got any questions about self-hosting N8N, drop them in the comments and I'll reply to everyone. And if you want to fast track your N8N skills, check out this full N8N course where you can build along with me a WhatsApp AI agent, over 10 modules to learn everything from agent configuration to data flow nodes to RAG using webhooks. See you there.